The blood on Margaret Owen's hands wasn't hers, but everyone in Fort Benton, Montana, believed it was proof of her guilt. She stood in the center of the dusty town square on that sweltering August afternoon in 1878, her wrists bound with rough rope, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, her gray dress torn and stained. The crowd surrounded her, their faces twisted with rage and righteousness, calling for justice that wasn't justice at all. She kept saying she was innocent, kept trying to explain what really happened in that boarding house room, but her voice was drowned out by their anger. Nobody wanted to hear the truth when a lie was so much more convenient. Garrett Jensen had been riding hard for 3 days straight when he arrived at the outskirts of Fort Benton. His horse was tired, his throat was parched, and all he wanted was a whiskey and a soft bed. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, weathered skin from years under the sun, and green eyes that missed very little. At 28 years old, he had seen enough of the frontier to know that things weren't always what they seemed. He made his living breaking horses, and sometimes tracking down rustlers for ranchers who could afford his services. He wasn't a lawman and didn't pretend to be, but he had a sense of right and wrong that ran deep. The commotion in the town square caught his attention before he even reached the main street. He could hear shouting, the ugly kind that came from a mob working itself into a frenzy. He urged his horse forward, curiosity mixing with concern. Fort Benton was supposed to be a civilized place, one of the oldest settlements in Montana Territory, sitting right on the Missouri River where the steamboats came up from St. Louis. It had law and order, churches and schools. This kind of chaos didn't fit. When he got close enough to see what was happening, he spotted her immediately. The woman in the center of the crowd looked terrified but defiant, her chin raised even as tears streaked down her face. She was young, maybe 24 or 25, with delicate features and eyes that blazed with desperate conviction. A man in a sheriff's badge stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but doing nothing to stop the crowd from pressing closer. She killed him in cold blood. Someone shouted. Murderess! Another voice cried out. String her up. Garrett dismounted, tying his horse to a post outside the general store. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. He had seen guilty people before, and they rarely looked like this woman did. She didn't have the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had crossed that line, didn't have the resignation that came with knowing you had done something unforgivable. Instead, she looked like someone fighting for her life against impossible odds. He pushed his way through the crowd, using his size to create space. People protested, but he kept moving until he reached the inner circle where the sheriff stood with the bound woman. What's going on here? Garrett asked, his voice cutting through the noise. The sheriff, a middle-aged man with a drooping mustache and tired eyes, looked at him with a mixture of relief and annoyance. None of your concern, stranger, town business. I am making it my concern, Garrett said evenly. What is she accused of? Murder, the sheriff said flatly. Thomas Brennan was found dead in his room at the boarding house this morning. She was there, covered in his blood, holding the knife. Garrett looked at the woman. She met his gaze, and he saw something flicker in her expression. Hope, maybe, or just surprise that someone was asking questions instead of shouting accusations. Did she confess? Garrett asked. She says she didn't do it, the sheriff admitted, but the evidence is clear. Evidence can tell different stories depending on how you look at it, Garrett said. He turned his attention to the woman. What is your name? Margaret Owen, she said, her voice shaking but clear. And I did not kill Thomas Brennan. I found him like that. I was trying to help him, trying to stop the bleeding, but he was already gone. Lies, shouted a woman from the crowd. She was his mistress. When he refused to leave his wife for her, she murdered him. Margaret's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "That is not true. I was never his mistress. I was his wife's seamstress. I went to his room because his wife asked me to deliver some mending she had done for him. When I arrived, the door was open and I found him on the floor. I tried to help him." Garrett studied her face, watched the way her eyes never wavered, the way her hands clenched despite the rope binding them. He had a good instinct for when people were lying, and everything about her screamed truth. Why would his wife send you instead of going herself? Someone in the crowd challenged. "Because she was ill," Margaret said desperately. "She had a fever. She did not want to leave her bed but wanted him to have his mended shirt before he left on his trip." "Convenient story," the sheriff muttered. "Did anyone ask the wife?" Garrett interjected. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Brennan is distraught. She is not in a state to answer questions. Maybe because she lost her husband, or maybe because she has something to hide," Garrett suggested quietly. The crowd's anger turned toward him then. "Who are you to come here and question us?" a burly man demanded. "We know what we saw. She was caught red-handed." "I am someone who has seen enough rush to judgment to know it often leads to wrong being done," Garrett replied. His hand rested casually near his revolver, not threatening but present. "I think before anyone does something they cannot take back, there should be a proper investigation. We do not need outsiders telling us how to handle our business," another man growled. Margaret was watching him with wide eyes now, and when she spoke, her voice was directed at him alone. "Thank you for seeing the truth, or at least for being willing to look for it." Those words hit Garrett harder than they should have. There was such raw gratitude in them, such desperate hope. He made a decision in that moment, one that would change the course of his life in ways he could not imagine. "Sheriff, I am offering my services as an investigator," Garrett said formally. "Free of charge. Give me 2 days to look into this properly. If I find evidence that confirms her guilt, so be it. But if there is any chance she is innocent, you will have that blood on your hands forever." The sheriff looked torn. The crowd was clearly against the idea, but Garrett could see the doubt in the lawman's eyes. He was not a bad man, just a tired one who wanted the easy answer. "One day," the sheriff finally said, "you have until sunset tomorrow, but she stays locked up, and if you find nothing, justice will be done." It was not ideal, but it was something. Garrett nodded. "Agreed." The sheriff gestured to his deputy, a young man who looked barely 20. "Take her to the jail." As Margaret was led away, she looked back at Garrett one more time. The gratitude in her eyes was mixed with fear now, fear that even this reprieve would not be enough. He gave her a small nod, a promise that he would do everything in his power to uncover the truth. The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering among themselves. Garrett heard the whispers, the suspicion now directed at him as much as at Margaret. He did not care. He had never been one to court popularity. He spent the rest of the afternoon methodically working through the scene. The boarding house was a 2-story building on the edge of the main street, respectable but worn. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Hawthorne, was tight-lipped and clearly believed Margaret was guilty, but she let him examine the room where Thomas Brennan had died. The room was small, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for belongings. There was still a dark stain on the wooden floor where the body had been found. Garrett crouched down, examining everything carefully. The blood pattern was consistent with someone bleeding out from a stab wound, but something about the scene troubled him. The bed was not disturbed. The trunk was closed. If there had been a struggle, there should have been more signs of it. He found the knife in the sheriff's office later, a kitchen knife with a plain wooden handle. It was the kind of knife found in every household, nothing distinctive about it. The blood on the blade was dried now, brown and crusted. Where exactly was she standing when you arrived? Garrett asked the sheriff. Kneeling beside the body, the sheriff said. The knife was on the floor next to her. She had blood on her hands and dress. Was anyone else in the boarding house at the time? Mrs. Hawthorne was downstairs. She heard nothing until Margaret started screaming for help. And Mrs. Brennan? She lives in a house on the north side of town. Nice place. Thomas was successful, owned the feed store, and had investments in a few of the mines. Why was he staying at the boarding house if he had a house? The sheriff looked uncomfortable. There were rumors of trouble in the marriage. Some said he had been staying there for the past week. Yet Margaret claims she was delivering mending from Mrs. Brennan to her husband, Garrett mused. That suggests contact between them, even if they were having difficulties. He left the sheriff's office and walked through the town as evening fell. Fort Benton was alive with activity, steamboat workers unloading cargo at the levee, prospectors drinking away their disappointments in the saloons, families finishing their evening chores. It was a town that had seen its share of violence and scandal, but it prided itself on being more civilized than some of the rougher camps further south. Garrett found the Brennan house without difficulty. It was indeed a nice place, painted white with green shutters and a well-tended garden. He knocked on the door, expecting to be turned away, but instead a young woman in a maid's uniform answered and, after a moment's hesitation, let him in. Mrs. Brennan received him in the parlor. She was a woman in her early 30s, attractive in a fragile way, with fair hair and pale skin. Her eyes were red from crying, and she clutched a handkerchief in her hands. I am sorry for your loss, Garrett said sincerely. I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about Margaret Owen. Mrs. Brennan's face hardened. That woman murdered my husband. What more is there to know? I need to understand the circumstances, Garrett said gently. She claims you sent her to deliver mending to your husband at the boarding house. Is that true? Mrs. Brennan looked away. I do not remember. I was ill that morning. I still am not feeling well. But is it possible you asked her to make that delivery? I suppose it is possible, she admitted reluctantly. Margaret had done some sewing work for me, but that does not change what she did. Why was your husband staying at the boarding house? Garrett asked. The question clearly struck a nerve. Mrs. Brennan's hands twisted the handkerchief tighter. That is a private matter. I understand, but it may be relevant to what happened. She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas and I had been having difficulties. He had been spending more time away from home. I suspected he was having an affair, though he denied it. He moved to the boarding house a week ago, saying he needed space to think about our marriage. Did you suspect Margaret of being the other woman? Mrs. Brennan shook her head. No, Margaret was always professional, always proper. If Thomas was seeing someone, it was not her. Then who? I do not know, she said, and there was real anguish in her voice. He would not tell me. He said I was imagining things, but a wife knows. Garrett left the Brennan house with more questions than answers. If Thomas had been having an affair, that opened up other possibilities. A jealous mistress, an angry husband, someone with a motive beyond what the simple narrative suggested. He went to the jail next. Margaret was sitting on the cot in her cell, her bound hands finally freed. She looked up when he entered, hope and fear warring in her expression. I talked to Mrs. Brennan, Garrett said. She confirmed that she might have asked you to deliver the mending, though she says she does not remember clearly because she was ill. She did ask me, Margaret insisted. I would never have gone to his room otherwise. It would not have been proper. Tell me exactly what happened when you arrived at the boarding house. Margaret closed her eyes, clearly reliving the moment. I arrived around 9 in the morning. Mrs. Hawthorne let me in. I went upstairs and found Mr. Brennan's room. The door was slightly open, which I thought was strange. I knocked, but there was no answer. I pushed the door open and saw him on the floor. There was so much blood. I dropped the mending and ran to him. I thought maybe I could help, maybe stop the bleeding, but when I touched him, I realized he was already dead. His skin was cold. I started screaming for help, and that is when Mrs. Hawthorne came running. "Did you see anyone else? Hear anything?" "No, the hallway was empty. The other rooms seemed quiet." "What about the knife?" "It was lying beside him. I did not touch it, I swear." I only touched him, trying to find a pulse, trying to understand what had happened. Garrett believed her. Everything about her story rang true, and more than that, the timeline did not quite work if she was the killer. If she had stabbed Thomas Brennan, there would have been more blood spatter, more evidence of a struggle. The scene was too clean for a crime of passion, too controlled. "There was someone else in that boarding house," Garrett said, more to himself than to her. "Someone who killed him and left before you arrived, or someone who was still there, hiding." "Will they believe you?" Margaret asked quietly. "Or will they hang me anyway because it is easier than finding the real killer?" "I will not let them hang you," Garrett said, and the conviction in his voice surprised even him. "I promise you that." She looked at him with those gray eyes, and something passed between them, something neither of them could name yet but both of them felt. "Why are you helping me?" "You do not even know me." "Because you deserve someone to believe you," Garrett said simply. "And because I can see the truth when I look at you." The next morning, Garrett was up before dawn. He had slept little, his mind working through the possibilities. He returned to the boarding house and this time questioned Mrs. Hawthorne more thoroughly. "Who else was staying here that morning?" he asked. Mrs. Hawthorne consulted her ledger. "There were 3 other guests. A traveling salesman named Albert Porter, a prospector called Dutch Henry, and a woman named Lillian Marsh who said she was waiting for her husband to arrive from Helena. I need to speak with all of them." Mr. Porter and Dutch Henry left that same day. They were only passing through. "But Miss Marsh is still here. Room 6. Garrett climbed the stairs and knocked on the door of room 6. A woman's voice called for him to wait, and a moment later the door opened. Lillian Marsh was perhaps 30 years old with auburn hair and sharp features. She was dressed well, too well for someone waiting on a husband who might or might not arrive. "I am investigating the death of Thomas Brennan," Garrett said. "I understand you were staying here when it happened." "Such a terrible thing," Lillian said, but her eyes were calculating. "That poor man." "Did you hear anything that morning? See anything unusual?" "I am afraid not. I was still asleep when the screaming started." "What time did you wake up?" "I do not recall exactly. Perhaps around 8:30 or 9. "And you heard nothing before that? No arguments, no sounds of struggle?" "Nothing at all." Garrett studied her face. She was lying. He could see it in the way she would not quite meet his eyes, in the tension in her shoulders. "Why are you really in Fort Benton, Miss Marsh?" "I told you. I am waiting for my husband." "What is his name?" She hesitated just a fraction too long. "Robert Marsh." "And where is he coming from?" "Helena. He had business there." Garrett nodded slowly. "I will be checking with the authorities in Helena to confirm your story." Something flickered across her face, fear maybe, or anger. "I do not appreciate being treated like a suspect. I had nothing to do with what happened to Mr. Brennan." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Garrett said evenly. He left her room but did not go far. He found a spot at the end of the hallway where he could watch her door without being easily seen. His instincts were screaming that Lillian Marsh was the key to this whole thing, and instincts like that were usually right. He did not have to wait long. Within an hour, Lillian emerged from her room, looking around nervously before hurrying down the stairs. Garrett followed at a distance. She walked quickly through town, heading toward the rougher district near the levee. She entered a small, shabby building that Garrett recognized as a boarding house even less reputable than Mrs. Hawthorne's establishment. Garrett waited a few minutes, then followed. The front door was unlocked, and he could hear voices coming from a room on the ground floor. He moved quietly, positioning himself where he could listen. "You said it would look like an accident," Lillian's voice, angry and frightened. "I did not expect that woman to show up when she did." A man's voice, rough and defensive. "She complicated everything. They are going to hang her for what you did. Better her than us. We stick to the story. Nobody knows anything. The money from Thomas's safe is hidden. Once this dies down, we can leave town and start fresh like we planned." Garrett had heard enough. He pushed open the door, his hand on his revolver. "I think you will be doing your starting fresh in prison." The man inside was perhaps 40, with a hard face and mean eyes. Garrett recognized the type. A con man, a killer when it suited him. Lillian gasped and stepped back, but the man went for his gun. Garrett was faster. He drew and fired, the bullet hitting the man's shoulder and spinning him around. The gun clattered to the floor. "Do not move," Garrett ordered, his weapon steady. Within minutes, the sheriff arrived with his deputy, drawn by the gunshot. Garrett explained what he had overheard, and under pressure, both Lillian and her accomplice, whose real name turned out to be Jack Sullivan, confessed to the whole scheme. Thomas Brennan had indeed been having an affair, but not with Margaret. Lillian had seduced him months ago, and together with her lover Jack, they had planned to rob him. When Thomas realized what was happening and threatened to go to the law, Jack had killed him. They had hoped to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, but when Margaret arrived unexpectedly, they saw an opportunity to pin the murder on her instead. Jack had hidden in the next room while Margaret discovered the body and screamed for help, then had slipped away in the confusion. The sheriff looked shaken as the full story came out. "We almost hanged an innocent woman," he said quietly. "You almost did," Garrett agreed, "but you did not." Margaret was released immediately. She stood in the jail office, blinking in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows, as if she could not quite believe she was free. When she saw Garrett, tears started flowing down her face. "You saved my life," she said, her voice breaking. "How can I ever thank you?" "You already did," Garrett replied. "When you said thank you for seeing the truth, that meant more than you know." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other, and Garrett felt something shift in his chest. This woman, with her courage and her honesty, had touched something in him that he had thought was long dead. The frontier was a hard place, and he had learned to keep his heart guarded. But Margaret Owen had gotten past his defenses without even trying. Over the following weeks, Garrett found reasons to stay in Fort Benton. He took work breaking horses for a local rancher, which gave him an excuse to remain in town. Margaret had returned to her small rented room and her work as a seamstress, but things had changed for her. The town's attitude had shifted from hostility to shame. People who had been ready to hang her now could barely meet her eyes. Garrett understood why she kept to herself. The trauma of nearly being executed for a crime she did not commit was not something that faded quickly. But he made a point of checking on her, of making sure she was all right. He would stop by with supplies from the general store, claiming he had bought too much. He would invite her to walk along the river in the evenings, where they could talk away from the prying eyes of the town. At first, their conversations were tentative. Margaret was still raw from her ordeal, still jumping at shadows. But gradually, as the days turned into weeks, she began to relax around him. She told him about her life, how she had come to Fort Benton 2 years ago after her parents died in an influenza outbreak in St. Louis. She had learned sewing from her mother and had built a modest business for herself here, enough to live on if she was careful. Garrett told her about his own past. about growing up on a small ranch in Colorado, about losing his father to raiders when he was 16 and having to become a man overnight. He had drifted for years, working where he could, building a reputation as someone who was good with horses and better at solving problems. He had never stayed anywhere long, never let himself get attached to people or places. Why not? Margaret asked one evening as they sat on the bank of the Missouri River, watching the water flow past in the fading light. Because everywhere I went I saw more of the same, Garrett said honestly. Violence, greed, people hurting each other for no good reason. It seemed easier not to care too much. But you cared about what happened to me, Margaret said softly. You cared about the truth. I did, Garrett admitted. I do. She reached over and took his hand. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily, and the simple gesture sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the summer heat. You gave me back my life, she said. But more than that, you gave me back my faith that there are good people in this world. I had lost that. In that moment when the crowd was calling for my death, I felt so alone, so abandoned. And then you appeared and you believed me when no one else would. I could see the truth in your eyes, Garrett said. It was not hard. It was hard, Margaret corrected gently. The whole town had already decided I was guilty. It would have been so much easier for you to just ride on, to not get involved. But you stayed. You fought for me. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands still linked, watching the river. Garrett could feel something building between them, something that both excited and terrified him. He had never expected to fall in love. He had certainly never expected to fall in love with a woman he had saved from hanging. But the heart did not follow logic, and his heart was making its preferences very clear. As September arrived and the Montana weather began to cool, Garrett and Margaret grew closer. He would meet her after she finished her sewing work, and they would walk through town or ride out into the countryside. She showed him her favorite spots along the river, places where wildflowers still bloomed and the cottonwood trees turned gold in the autumn sun. He taught her how to ride better, patient and encouraging when she was nervous on the horse. The town watched their growing attachment with mixed feelings. Some people were happy for Margaret, glad that something good had come from the nightmare she had endured. Others whispered that it was inappropriate, that not enough time had passed, that Garrett was just a drifter who would break her heart and move on. Garrett heard the whispers and ignored them. He knew his own mind, knew his own heart. For the first time in his 28 years, he had found someone who made him want to stay in one place, someone who made him think about building a future instead of just surviving day to day. One evening in late September, he took Margaret to a spot outside town where the land rose up, and you could see the Missouri River winding through the valley below, the mountains in the distance turning purple in the twilight. He had packed a simple meal, bread and cheese and apples, and they sat on a blanket he had spread on the grass. "I need to tell you something," Garrett said, his heart pounding harder than it ever had facing down a dangerous criminal. Margaret looked at him with those gray eyes that had haunted his dreams since the first day he saw her. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about my future," he began. "About what I want from life. I have spent so many years just drifting, never putting down roots. But being here, being with you, has changed something in me." "Garrett," Margaret said softly, and there was a world of emotion in just his name. "I love you," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it has not been long, and I know the circumstances of how we met were terrible, but I cannot deny what I feel. You are the strongest, bravest, most honest person I have ever met. You faced death with courage, and you have faced life after that with even more courage. I want to be part of your life if you will have me." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she said. "I think I started loving you that first day when you stood up for me in the town square. No one had ever fought for me like that before. And every day since, you have shown me what it means to be truly seen, truly valued. Yes, Garrett, I will have you. I want nothing more than to build a life with you." He kissed her then, soft and tender, and it felt like coming home after a long journey. The world around them faded away until there was just the two of them, two broken people who had found wholeness in each other. They were married in October, in a small ceremony at the church in Fort Benton. Mrs. Brennan attended, one of the few townspeople who made the effort. She had apologized to Margaret for not being stronger in her defense, for being too consumed by her own grief and suspicion to see the truth. The two women had made their peace, and Margaret had even made Mrs. Brennan's mourning clothes, refusing payment. Garrett had used his savings to buy a small parcel of land just outside town, with a creek running through it and good grass for horses. He built them a cabin with his own hands, working through the autumn chill to get it ready before winter arrived. It was not fancy, just one large room with a loft and a stone fireplace, but it was theirs. Margaret made the cabin a home. She sewed curtains for the windows and quilts for their bed. She planted a kitchen garden that would lie dormant through the winter but would bloom come spring. She cooked meals on the hearth and filled the space with her laughter and her love. Garrett started a horse-breaking business in earnest, working with the local ranchers who appreciated his skill and his honesty. The work was good, and the money was steady. More than that, he found satisfaction in it. Teaching a wild horse to trust, to work with humans instead of against them, felt meaningful in a way his previous drifting never had. Their first winter together was hard in some ways. Montana winters were brutal, and there were days when the snow piled so high they could not leave the cabin. But those days became precious to them, time to simply be together, to talk and dream and make plans for the future. They played cards by the fireplace, read aloud from the few books Margaret owned, and held each other close when the wind howled outside. Margaret told him one night about the fear that still sometimes gripped her, the nightmares where she was back in that town square with the rope around her neck. "I wake up convinced it is happening again," she confessed, "and then I feel you beside me and I remember that I am safe." "You are safe," Garrett assured her, holding her tight. "I will never let anything happen to you." "I know," she whispered. "You have already proven that." As winter gave way to spring in 1879, their life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Garrett's business grew as word spread about his skill with horses. Margaret's sewing work also increased, as the women of Fort Benton slowly overcame their shame and began to patronize her again. She was gracious with them, never throwing their previous judgment in their faces, and they were grateful for her forgiveness. In May, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told Garrett one evening after dinner, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, her eyes shining with joy and fear. "A baby," Garrett said, wonder in his voice. He knelt beside her chair and placed his hand over hers. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked. "We have not talked about children." "I am happier than I have ever been," Garrett said honestly. "Scared out of my mind, but happy." They laughed together, and he kissed her stomach gently, already in love with this child who was barely more than a promise. The pregnancy was not easy. Margaret suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, and Garrett learned to cook passable meals and keep the house running when she was too ill to get out of bed. He was gentle with her, patient, never complaining about the extra work. He had broken wild horses. He could certainly handle household chores. As her stomach grew round and the baby made its presence known with kicks and movement, Margaret bloomed. She glowed with health and happiness, and Garrett thought she had never been more beautiful. He would sit with his hand on her belly in the evenings, feeling their child move, marveling at the miracle of it. "What should we name the baby?" Margaret asked one night. "If it is a girl, I would like to name her after my mother," Garrett said. "Sarah." "Sarah is a beautiful name," Margaret agreed. "And if it is a boy, what about James? It was my father's name." "James Jensen," Margaret said, trying it out. "I like it." Their son was born on a cold January night in 1880, arriving early and in a hurry. Garrett rode through a blizzard to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Carson, an experienced woman who had delivered half the babies in Fort Benton. She took charge of the situation with calm efficiency, and though the labor was long and difficult, Margaret came through it safely. When Garrett first held his son, something inside him broke open. This tiny, perfect human with his mother's gray eyes and his father's strong lungs was the most incredible thing he had ever seen. "Hello, James," he whispered. "Welcome to the world." Margaret, exhausted but radiant, smiled up at him. "We made something beautiful," she said. "We did," Garrett agreed. "We really did. Being parents changed them in ways both expected and surprising." The sleepless nights were hard, and there were times when they were both so tired they could barely think straight. But the joy of watching James grow, of seeing his first smile and hearing his first laugh, made every difficult moment worthwhile. Garrett found himself working even harder, driven by the need to provide for his family. He expanded his business, taking on a young man named Peter as an apprentice. Peter was 18 and eager to learn, and having help meant Garrett could take on more horses and make more money. Margaret balanced her sewing work with caring for James, often working with the baby in a basket beside her. She sang while she sewed, old songs her mother had taught her, and James would watch her with wide eyes, soothed by her voice. The town had fully accepted them now. Margaret's courage and Garrett's integrity had won over even the most skeptical. They had friends, people they could count on, a community that felt like home. When James was 6 months old, Mrs. Brennan came to visit. She had remarried, a widower named Henry Foster who ran the telegraph office, and she seemed genuinely happy for the first time since Garrett had known her. "I wanted to thank you both," she said, sitting in their cabin with a cup of tea. "If you had not uncovered the truth about Thomas's death, I would have spent the rest of my life thinking Margaret had killed him. I would have carried that hatred and that pain forever. Instead, I was able to grieve properly and move on with my life." "We are glad you found happiness," Margaret said warmly. "You deserve it." After Mrs. Foster left, Garrett pulled Margaret into his arms. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" he asked. "If I had ridden past Fort Benton that day, if I had not stopped when I saw the crowd." "I try not to," Margaret admitted. "It frightens me to think how close I came to dying, but I am grateful every single day that you did stop. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved." "You saved mine too," Garrett said. "I was just existing before I met you, just moving from place to place without purpose. You gave me a reason to stay, a reason to build something lasting." They stood there in their small cabin, their baby sleeping peacefully in his cradle, the life they had built together surrounding them, and felt complete. As James grew into a toddler, their life continued to expand and deepen. Garrett's horse-breaking business thrived, and they were able to build an addition onto the cabin, giving them a proper bedroom and a separate room for James. They added a barn and corrals for the horses, and Garrett bought more land, planning for the future. Margaret's sewing business also grew. She began not just mending clothes, but designing and making new garments. Women came from as far as Helena to have her make them dresses for special occasions. She hired a young woman named Clara to help with the simpler work, and the two of them would sit together, sewing and talking while James played at their feet. In 1882, Margaret told Garrett she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she carried the baby with less sickness and more confidence. Their daughter was born on a warm June evening, arriving so quickly that the midwife barely made it in time. They named her Sarah as they had planned, and she was a peaceful baby, content to sleep and nurse and observe the world with her father's green eyes. James, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her. Garrett watched his family grow with a sense of deep satisfaction. This was what he had been searching for all those years, even when he had not known he was searching. Purpose, connection, love that ran so deep it changed the very foundation of who he was. One evening when Sarah was about 6 months old, Garrett and Margaret sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains. James was playing in the yard with a wooden horse Garrett had carved for him, and Sarah was sleeping in Margaret's arms. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Garrett asked. "In the town square." "I said a lot of things that day," Margaret replied with a soft smile. "I was terrified." "You said thank you for seeing the truth," Garrett reminded her. "Those words have stayed with me ever since." "They were the truest words I have ever spoken," Margaret said. "You did see the truth when everyone else only saw what they wanted to see. You looked at me and saw a person worth saving." "I saw the woman I was going to fall in love with," Garrett said. "I did not know it then, but looking back, I think part of me recognized you from the very first moment." "My heart knew you too," Margaret said. "Even in my terror, even when I thought I was going to die, there was something about you that made me feel safe." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only comes with deep intimacy and complete trust. James came running up with his toy horse, demanding that his father make horse sounds, and Garrett obliged, making his son giggle with delight. As the years passed, their family continued to grow. Another son, whom they named Matthew, was born in 1884. He was a wild child, always getting into trouble, climbing things he should not climb, and giving them both gray hairs before he was even out of diapers. Then came another daughter, Elizabeth, in 1887, completing their family of 5 children. Their house expanded to accommodate the growing brood. Garrett built a proper 2-story farmhouse, with separate bedrooms for the children and a large kitchen where Margaret could cook and bake. They added a front porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house, where they could sit in the evenings and watch their children play in the yard. Garrett's business had grown beyond just breaking horses. He was breeding them now, developing a line known for intelligence and endurance. Ranchers from all over Montana Territory came to buy horses from him, and his reputation spread even further. Peter, his apprentice, had become a partner, and together they employed several other men. Margaret's sewing had evolved into a full dressmaking business. She had 3 women working for her now, and they operated out of a small shop in Fort Benton proper. She designed clothes that were both practical and beautiful, perfect for the frontier life, and her creations were in high demand. They had become prosperous, far beyond what either of them had dreamed possible. But the money was not what mattered most to them. It was the life they had built, the family they had raised, the love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. James grew into a serious young man who loved working with horses like his father. Sarah was gentle and artistic, spending hours drawing and painting when she was not helping her mother with the sewing. Matthew was the adventurer, always talking about seeing the world beyond Montana. Elizabeth, the baby, was spirited and stubborn, determined to keep up with her older siblings no matter what. Garrett and Margaret watched their children grow with pride and occasional terror. Raising children on the frontier was never easy. There were illnesses, accidents, and the constant worry that something would go wrong. But they faced it all together, their partnership as strong as ever. One night in 1892, when they had been married for nearly 14 years, Garrett and Margaret lay in bed talking after the children had finally settled down for the night. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" Garrett asked with a laugh. "Before all this chaos?" "Never," Margaret said firmly. "Well, maybe sometimes when Matthew is climbing on the roof or Elizabeth is refusing to take her nap. But overall, never. This life, this family, it is everything I never knew I needed." "I feel the same way," Garrett said. He pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "You know, I have been thinking about that day in 1878, the day we met." "That terrible, wonderful day," Margaret murmured. "If someone had told me then that stopping in Fort Benton would lead to all this, to you and our children and this whole beautiful life, I would not have believed them." "I would not have believed it either," Margaret said. "When I was standing in that town square waiting to die, I could not have imagined that my Savior would become my husband, my partner, the father of my children." "You saved me too, you know," Garrett said seriously. "I was lost before I found you. I did not even know how lost I was." Margaret turned to face him, her hand cupping his cheek. "We saved each other. That is what love does. It saves us from our loneliness, from our despair, from the parts of ourselves that have given up." They made love that night with the tenderness that comes from years of intimacy, from knowing each other's bodies and hearts as well as they knew their own. Afterward, they lay tangled together, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around them, their children breathing in their rooms, the horses shifting in the barn outside. "Thank you," Margaret whispered in the darkness. "For what?" Garrett asked. "For seeing the truth," she said, echoing those words from so long ago. "For believing in me when no one else would. For giving me this life." "Thank you for trusting me," Garrett replied. "For letting me love you, for making me a better man than I ever thought I could be." As 1893 arrived, their eldest son James, now 13, had become a skilled horseman in his own right. He worked alongside his father and Peter, learning the business from the ground up. Garrett watched his son with pride, seeing himself at that age, but also seeing something gentler, something that came from being raised with love and security rather than hardship and loss. Sarah, at 11, had started helping more in her mother's dressmaking shop. She had an eye for design that even exceeded Margaret's, and customers specifically requested her input on their orders. Margaret encouraged her daughter's talent, remembering how her own mother had taught her to sew, and how that skill had saved her life in more ways than one. Matthew, at 9, was still the wildest of the children, but he was also the most charismatic. He could charm anyone, and Garrett suspected he would either become a very successful businessman or get into terrible trouble. Possibly both. Elizabeth, at 6, was starting school and driving her teacher to distraction with her endless questions and stubborn independence. She reminded Garrett so much of Margaret, with that same fire and determination that had helped her survive when the world had turned against her. Fort Benton continued to grow and change around them. Montana had become a state in 1889, and the wild frontier of their early years was slowly being tamed. The railroad had come through, bringing more people and more commerce. The steamboats still plied the Missouri, but not as many as before. Garrett and Margaret had become pillars of the community. People looked to them for wisdom and leadership. Garrett served on the town council, helping make decisions about schools and roads and public safety. Margaret organized fundraisers for the church and the school, using her connections and her business acumen to benefit the whole community. They never forgot where they came from, though. They never forgot that terrible day when Margaret had stood accused and alone, and Garrett had been the only one willing to stand up for her. That memory kept them humble, kept them compassionate toward others who found themselves in difficult circumstances. They helped people who were down on their luck, hired men who were trying to rebuild their lives, gave credit at their businesses to families struggling through hard times. They did not make a show of their charity. They simply did what they believed was right. One spring day in 1895, a young woman came to Margaret's dress shop. She was poorly dressed and looked frightened, asking if there was any work available. Margaret recognized the desperation in her eyes, the same desperation she herself had felt all those years ago. "What is your name?" Margaret asked kindly. "Anna Reed, madam," the girl said. She could not have been more than 19. "Well, Anna, I think we can find something for you," Margaret said. "Have you any experience with sewing?" "Some, madam. My mother taught me before she passed." Margaret hired Anna on the spot, and over the following weeks, she learned the girl's story. Anna had come to Fort Benton fleeing an abusive situation, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need for safety and independence. Margaret took her under her wing, just as others had done for her, teaching her not just sewing but how to build a life of dignity and self-reliance. When Garrett learned what Margaret had done, he was not surprised. "You have always had a generous heart," he said. "I remember what it was like to be alone and afraid," Margaret replied. "If I can help someone else find their way, then all the pain I went through means something." Anna flourished under Margaret's mentorship, and within a year, she had become one of the most skilled seamstresses in the shop. She also caught the eye of Peter, Garrett's former apprentice and now partner. The two began courting, and Garrett and Margaret watched with pleasure as another love story unfolded. Their own children were growing up fast. James, at 15, was talking about starting his own horse breeding program, focusing on draft horses for the mines and logging camps. Garrett encouraged him, giving him the resources and guidance to pursue his dream. Sarah, at 13, had begun taking commissions for painted portraits along with her dress design work. She had real talent, and people were willing to pay for her art. Margaret made sure her daughter understood the value of financial independence, teaching her how to manage money and build a business. Matthew, at 11, had surprised everyone by developing a passion for books. He read everything he could get his hands on and talked about becoming a lawyer someday. Garrett, who had limited formal education himself, made sure his son had access to every educational opportunity available. Elizabeth, at 8, had declared she was going to be a rancher like her father, and she spent every spare moment in the barn or out with the horses. She was fearless in a way that both impressed and terrified her parents. The youngest child, Thomas, born in 1890, was 5 years old and still figuring out who he was. He was quieter than the others, more introspective, and seemed to find joy in simple things like watching ants carry food or listening to rain on the roof. Garrett and Margaret's life was full, rich with purpose and meaning. They had built something that would last beyond their own lifetimes, a legacy of love and integrity that their children would carry forward. One evening in the summer of 1896, they hosted a large gathering at their home. It had become an annual tradition, a celebration of their anniversary and a chance to bring together family and friends. Anna and Peter were there, now married themselves. Mrs. Foster, the former Mrs. Brennan, came with her husband and their 2 young sons. The sheriff who had almost presided over Margaret's hanging had long since retired, but he came to the party every year, a living reminder of how wrong things could go and how important it was to seek truth over convenience. As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the yard, Garrett stood on the porch and looked out at the gathering. His children were running around with other kids, playing games in the twilight. Margaret was talking with a group of women, her laugh carrying across the yard. Friends and neighbors were eating and drinking and enjoying themselves, all of them connected by the community they had built together. Peter came to stand beside him. "You have done well for yourself, boss," he said. Peter still called him that sometimes, a holdover from their early days together. "We have all done well," Garrett replied. "This was never just about me or Margaret. It was about building something good, something lasting." "You two set the example," Peter said. "You showed all of us what was possible if you just had courage and integrity." Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the children were in bed, Garrett and Margaret walked down to the creek that ran through their property. The moon was full, casting silver light across the water, and the summer air was warm and gentle. 18 years, Margaret said, taking Garrett's hand. 18 years since you saved my life. 18 years since you changed mine, Garrett replied. They stood by the water, listening to it burble over the rocks, feeling the peace that came from a life well lived and a love well nurtured. "Do you remember how scared we were when James was born?" Margaret asked with a laugh. "We had no idea what we were doing." "We still do not half the time," Garrett said, "but we figure it out together." "That is our secret," Margaret said. "We have always figured it out together." They kissed in the moonlight, these two people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and had built the best of lives. Their story could have ended in tragedy, in injustice, in loss. Instead, it had become a testament to the power of truth, courage, and love. As the years continued to pass, their children grew into adults who made them proud. James took over the horse breeding business, expanding it in ways even Garrett had not imagined. Sarah moved to Helena and opened her own design house, creating dresses for the wealthy women of Montana's capital. Matthew did indeed become a lawyer, using his skills to help people who could not afford legal representation. Elizabeth married a rancher and ran her own successful cattle operation. Thomas became a teacher, finding his purpose in educating the next generation. Garrett and Margaret stepped back from their businesses gradually, handing over the reins to younger people while still remaining involved and active. They traveled some, visiting their children and seeing parts of the country they had never seen before. But they always came back to Fort Benton, to the home they had built, to the land they loved. In 1910, they celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, their grandchildren, and friends who had become family. Garrett was 60 years old now, his hair silver, his face weathered by decades in the sun. Margaret was 56, her beauty having matured into something deeper and more lasting than youth. They stood together in the yard of their home, watching their grandchildren play the same games their children had played years before. Life had come full circle in the best possible way. "You have any regrets?" Margaret asked Garrett as they stood there together. "Not a single one," Garrett replied honestly. "Every choice I made, every road I took led me to you. How could I regret any of it?" "I have one regret," Margaret said, and Garrett looked at her in surprise. "I regret that we lost so much time before we met. I wish I could have known you when we were younger, wish we could have had even more years together." "We have had 32 years," Garrett said gently. "And God willing, we will have many more. That is more than most people ever get." "You are right," Margaret agreed. "And I am grateful for every single day." That night, lying in bed in the house they had built together, Garrett and Margaret talked late into the night the way they had always done. They talked about their children and grandchildren, about the changes they had seen in Montana over the decades, about the future and what it might hold. "I never thought I would live this long," Margaret admitted. "When I was standing in that town square in 1878, I was sure my life was over at 24 years old. Everything after that has felt like borrowed time." "It is not borrowed," Garrett said firmly. "It is yours. You earned every day of it with your courage and your strength." "We earned it together," Margaret corrected. "I would not have had any of this without you." "Thank you for letting me love you," Garrett said. "Thank you for building this life with me." "Thank you for seeing the truth," Margaret replied, those words that had bonded them from the very beginning. "Thank you for believing in me." They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had done thousands of times before, safe in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. The years continued to be kind to them. They remained healthy and active well into their 60s and 70s, still involved in their community, still surrounded by family and friends. Their love story became something of a legend in Fort Benton, told and retold as an example of how justice and compassion could triumph over hatred and fear. Young couples would sometimes come to them for advice, and Garrett and Margaret would share the wisdom they had earned through decades of partnership. "Listen to each other," Margaret would say. "Really listen, not just to the words but to the heart behind them." "Trust each other," Garrett would add. "Even when it is hard, even when you are scared, trust is the foundation of everything else." "And never stop seeing each other," they would say together. "Keep looking for the truth in each other, the best in each other. That is what love really is." In 1918, as the First World War finally ended and the world began to rebuild, Garrett and Margaret celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. They were 70 and 66 years old, respectively, and though their bodies had slowed, their minds were still sharp, and their love was still strong. All 5 of their children came home for the celebration, along with their spouses and children. The house was full of laughter and noise, 3 generations gathered together. Garrett looked around at the family he and Margaret had created and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was his legacy, not the successful business or the land he owned, but these people, connected by love and raised with values that would endure. As the party wound down and their children and grandchildren prepared to head back to their own homes, James pulled his parents aside. "We have been talking," he said, gesturing to his siblings, "and we want you to know how much you mean to us, how much your example has shaped our lives." "You showed us what real love looks like," Sarah added, tears in her eyes. "You showed us what it means to stand up for what is right, even when it is hard." "You gave us the best possible foundation," Matthew said. "Everything we have accomplished we owe to you." "You taught us to be strong," Elizabeth said, "to be independent but also to value partnership and family." "You taught us to be kind," Thomas added quietly, "to see people for who they really are, not for what others say about them." Garrett and Margaret were deeply moved by their children's words. "You made it easy," Margaret said through her tears. "You were such good children, and you have become such good people." "We are proud of all of you," Garrett added, his voice gruff with emotion. "More proud than you can imagine." After everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Garrett and Margaret sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains, the same mountains they had watched together for 40 years. "We did good, did we not?" Garrett said. "We did very good," Margaret agreed. "I love you," Garrett said. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you in that town square, and I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Margaret replied. "You are my savior, my partner, my best friend, my everything." They sat together as darkness fell. 2 people who had beaten the odds, who had turned tragedy into triumph, who had built a love story that would endure long after they were gone. The story of the cowboy who had rescued a woman no one else believed, And the woman who had thanked him for seeing the truth had become a story of a life built together, of children raised and legacy created, of love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. It was a story that had started with fear and injustice, but had transformed into something beautiful and lasting. It was a story that proved that courage and integrity still mattered, that truth was worth fighting for, that love could conquer even the darkest circumstances. And it was a story that would be told for generations to come, a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simple act of believing in someone when the rest of the world has given up. Garrett and Margaret Jensen lived into their 80s, dying within months of each other in 1925, their hands still linked even at the end. Their children and grandchildren mourned them, but also celebrated them, knowing that they had lived full lives rich with love and purpose. The legacy they left behind was not measured in money or property, though there was plenty of both. It was measured in the values they had instilled, the community they had strengthened, the example they had set. It was measured in the love they had shared, a love that had started with a cowboy seeing the truth in a desperate woman's eyes, and had grown into something that transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. Their story ended not with tragedy or loss, but with fulfillment and peace. 2 lives well lived, 2 hearts perfectly joined, 2 souls who had found exactly what they were meant to find in each other. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of ending they had earned, exactly the kind of love they had built, exactly the kind of life they had dreamed of when they first stood together and decided to face whatever came next side by side. And in Fort Benton, Montana, where their story had begun on that terrible and wonderful day in 1878, people still told the tale of Garrett and Margaret Jensen, the cowboy and the woman he had saved, the couple who had built a love story for the ages.